It was a map designed to lead to a place that didn't exist, but it ended up revealing a truth that was never supposed to be found. On May 14, 1999, a brilliant 28-year-old historian named Claire Donovan walked into the Sonoran Desert in Arizona and simply vanished. For 10 long years, her case was a haunting local legend, a cautionary tale of a woman swallowed by the unforgiving wilderness. Her family was left with nothing but silence and theories that led nowhere. That is, until an accidental discovery inside a weathered backpack rewrote the entire story, exposing a meticulously crafted lie. How is it possible that the evidence of a deadly conspiracy remained hidden for a decade, just a few miles from where everyone had been looking? Before we reveal how a single hand-altered map found in a remote crevice unraveled everything, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Believe me, you won't want to miss the chain of events this one discovery triggered. Claire Donovan was not a reckless thrill-seeker. She was the heart of the story, the reason this mystery endured. At 28, she was a passionate academic from Tucson, the only daughter of a retired literature professor who adored her. Her life's work was dedicated to rewriting the history of the region's indigenous trade routes, specifically those of the Tohono O'odham people. She believed their history was far richer and more complex than the official records showed, and she feared that knowledge would be lost forever. Claire was an idealist, driven by a deep respect for the land and its people. Her defining trait was a profound trust in others, an unshakable belief in human goodness that, tragically, would become her fatal flaw. She saw history in the desert canyons, not the danger lurking within them. Her last day was a portrait of academic passion and quiet routine. The morning of May 14th was spent in the university library, her hands dusty from old texts, as she photocopied maps that held centuries of secrets. She said goodbye to her father with a hug and a simple promise. "I'll call from the first town with a payphone." For this crucial expedition into a remote section of the desert, she hadn't gone alone. She hired a well-regarded local guide, a man named Rick Thorne, whose knowledge of the treacherous terrain was said to be second to none. The last confirmed sighting of Claire was her Jeep pulling away from a dusty gas station in Ojo, Arizona, heading toward the vast, silent expanse of the desert horizon. The official story, the one that would be repeated for a decade, came solely from Rick Thorne. He told sheriff's deputies a harrowing tale of nature's sudden, overwhelming force. According to him, a violent dust storm, a haboob, erupted out of nowhere, engulfing the landscape in a blinding wall of sand. He claimed they were separated in the chaos. He searched for her, he said, his voice hoarse with panic, calling her name until his throat was raw, but the storm was too powerful. Eventually, he had to make the impossible choice to turn back to save his own life. It was a plausible, tragic story. The desert was known for its brutality, and Thorne was a respected professional. For the authorities, it seemed like an open and shut case of a life claimed by the elements. The immediate response was a flurry of desperate activity. Claire's father, upon hearing the news, felt a terror so profound it seemed to stop his own heart. He, along with local volunteers and the Pima County Sheriff's Department, mobilized a massive search. They scoured the desert on foot, in trucks, and from the air. But the Sonoran Desert is a formidable adversary. In 1999, technology was a limiting factor. GPS was not yet a common tool for civilians, and cell phone coverage was non-existent in these remote areas. Faced with a landscape that stretched for thousands of square miles, with countless canyons and crevices where a person could disappear forever, the search quickly turned hopeless. After less than a week, with no body and no clues, the official search was called off. The desert had won. For the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the case was tragically simple. Without a body, a crime scene, or any evidence to contradict the sole witness, Claire Donovan's disappearance was officially classified as an, quote, accidental death by exposure. Rick Thorne's testimony was compelling. He was a respected guide, and his story of a sudden, violent haboob was entirely plausible in that unforgiving landscape. The desert itself became the silent, unquestioned perpetrator. The investigation was closed in less than a week, the final report citing the overwhelming forces of nature. For the authorities, it was a practical decision driven by a lack of resources and the sheer impossibility of combing thousands of square miles of wilderness. But for those who knew Claire, this neat and tidy conclusion felt like a profound injustice, an erasure of a life that deserved more than a footnote in a file. While the official file gathered dust, Claire's father, Arthur Donovan, began his own private war against the silence. The world may have accepted the desert's verdict, but he could not. Her study, once a place of academic curiosity and vibrant thought, was slowly transformed into a somber investigation hub. Maps covered every wall, crisscrossed with colored string tracing possible routes and search grids. He spent his retirement savings on private investigators who came back empty-handed, on seasoned trackers who found nothing but wind-blown sand. Every evening he would sit at her desk, poring over her notes, her journals, and the police reports, searching for a single overlooked detail, a clue that the professionals had missed. He was no longer just a grieving father. He had become an archivist of his own daughter's absence, a lonely sentinel guarding a memory that refused to fade. The first anniversary of her disappearance was a quiet, public torture for Arthur. The local newspaper ran a small, sympathetic article, a brief reminder of the tragedy, before the community moved on to the next day's headlines. He held a small vigil at the edge of the desert, attended by a handful of Claire's close friends and former colleagues. This became the cruel pattern of his life, living with ambiguous loss. There was no grave to visit, no finality to mourn. His grief was a wound that could never close, suspended in a state of perpetual uncertainty. Was she out there somewhere, suffering? Or was he mourning a ghost? This limbo is a unique form of torment, a constant oscillation between a sliver of irrational hope and the crushing weight of a reality he couldn't bring himself to fully accept. Over the next few years, the silence was punctuated by cruel bursts of false hope. Anonymous calls would come in the middle of the night, claiming a sighting of a woman matching Claire's description at a border town cantina. A well-meaning but misguided psychic sent a letter with a hand-drawn map to a location that turned out to be an empty wash. Each lead, no matter how flimsy, sent Arthur on a desperate chase, reigniting a hope that was almost more painful than the grief itself. He would follow every thread, spend money he didn't have, only to be met with another dead end. These moments were a slow poison, eroding his spirit and finances. Yet he couldn't stop. To give up on a lead felt like giving up on Claire herself, a betrayal he was unwilling to commit. Meanwhile, Rick Thorne, the only person to see Claire Donovan alive on that final day, quietly resumed his life. He continued to work as a desert guide, his reputation paradoxically enhanced by the tragedy. He was seen as a man who had stared into the abyss of nature's fury and survived. To the community of Ajo, he was a somber figure, a man carrying a heavy memory, but he never spoke of it unless asked. He showed no outward signs of trauma, his composure unwavering. This unsettling normalcy stood in stark contrast to the all-consuming grief that had shattered Arthur Donovan's world. Investigators noted it, but saw no reason for suspicion. After all, people cope with trauma in different ways, but, for those watching closely, a nagging question remained. How could someone walk away from such an event so completely unscathed? As the years stretched on, Claire's story began to morph. In the collective memory of the region, the sharp edges of the tragedy softened, and she evolved from a real person into a piece of local folklore. She became the lost historian, a cautionary tale told to tourists about the dangers of the Sonoran desert. Newcomers to the area would hear the myth, but they wouldn't know her name, the color of her eyes, or the passion that drove her. For Arthur, this was a second, more insidious kind of disappearance. Not only had he lost his daughter to the wilderness, but he was now losing her memory to time and indifference. The world was forgetting the brilliant, loving woman she was, replacing her with a ghost story. It was an erasure he fought against every single day in the quiet solitude of her room. By 2009, a full decade had passed. The file on Claire Donovan was buried deep in the cold case archives of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, marked inactive. The private investigators had long since stopped calling. The world had moved on. But for Arthur Donovan, time had stood still. Now in his late 60s, his hair grayer and his steps slower, he still maintained his nightly ritual. He would enter Claire's study, switch on the desk lamp, and stare at the wall of maps, a silent testament to 10 years of unanswered questions and unrelenting pain. All hope for a breakthrough had withered, replaced by a grim, monotonous duty to simply remember. The silence from the desert was absolute, a final, unassailable wall. It seemed the truth, like Claire herself, had been swallowed forever by the sand. Then, on a crisp October morning in 2009, the desert finally decided to give up one of its secrets. The catalyst was not a determined investigator or a high-tech search team, but a young tour guide named Ethan Cole. He was leading a small group of amateur photographers along a little-used trail, miles from any designated park area. A recent unseasonable flash flood had carved a new path through the landscape, triggering a rock slide that had been unnoticed until now. As Ethan navigated his group around the fresh debris, he spotted it, a dark opening in a sandstone cliff face, a crevice that had been sealed by fallen rock for what looked like a very long time. Curiosity, a guide's best and sometimes most dangerous instinct, compelled him to take a closer look. Inside the crevice, protected from a decade of sun and storms, lay a weathered canvas backpack. It was partially covered in sand, but the faded University of Arizona logo was still visible. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the morning air. He knew the stories. Every guide in the region knew the legend of the lost historian. With a sense of reverence and caution, he gently pulled the backpack from its tomb of sand. Inside, the contents were perfectly preserved: a half-full metal canteen, a tarnished brass compass, and a well-worn book of local Tohono O'odham legends. It was a time capsule of a young woman's final day, a silent testament to a life cut short. But it was what he found tucked inside the book that changed everything. Carefully folded into the chapter on desert spirits was an old topographical map. As an expert on the terrain, Ethan knew these canyons like the back of his hand. He unfolded the map and immediately saw that something was profoundly wrong. It had been hand-altered with a pen, marking a specific route and circling a destination labeled Whisper Oasis. Ethan stared at the name, tracing the coordinates with his finger. He had hiked every inch of this territory for years. There was no Whisper Oasis. It wasn't a forgotten landmark or a local nickname. It was a place that simply did not exist. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate, calculated fabrication. A heavy realization settled over Ethan. This backpack was more than just a tragic memento. It was evidence. The altered map suggested deception, a pre-planned misdirection. His first instinct was to call the sheriff, but he hesitated. The official case had been closed for 10 years, dismissed as a tragic accident. He feared this crucial piece of evidence would be logged, filed away, and lost in the same bureaucratic indifference that had failed the Donovan family a decade earlier. He felt a different kind of duty, not to the authorities, but to the memory of the woman herself. He knew there was only one person who deserved to see this first. The man who had never given up the search, Claire's father, Arthur Donovan. The meeting took place in the quiet solemnity of Claire's study, a room that had become Arthur Donovan's personal shrine in prison. When Ethan placed the dusty backpack on the desk, the old man stared at it, as if he were looking at a ghost. His hands trembled as he reached out, his fingers tracing the stitched university logo. For 10 years he had lived with nothing but memories and theories. Now here was something real, something tangible that his daughter had touched on her last day. Tears welled in his eyes, not of pure grief, but of a complex, heart-wrenching mixture of pain and a sudden, terrifying flicker of hope. He opened the backpack slowly, as if the contents were sacred relics, each item a whisper from a past he thought was lost forever. Together they spread the altered map under the bright light of the desk lamp. Arthur retrieved a magnifying glass, his hand shaking slightly as he held it over the penciled annotations. He immediately confirmed Ethan's suspicion. "This isn't her handwriting," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Claire's script was precise, almost like calligraphy. This is rushed, blocky. Someone else wrote this. It was the first concrete piece of evidence in a decade that contradicted the official narrative. Someone had deliberately marked this map to lead Claire to a non-existent place. The story of a simple hiker lost in a storm began to crumble, replaced by the chilling shadow of intentional deceit. She hadn't just gotten lost, she had been led astray. Driven by a sudden, desperate intuition, Arthur picked up the book of legends where the map had been hidden. He ran his fingers along the spine, feeling for any irregularity. As a literature professor, he knew old books could hold secrets in their very construction. He felt a slight bulge. Using a small pocket knife, he carefully pried open the binding. Tucked deep inside was a single, folded piece of paper. It wasn't a note or a letter. It was a receipt from a geological supply store in Tucson, dated May 12, 1999, 2 days before Claire disappeared. The invoice was for the purchase of specialized core drilling equipment, items a historian would have no use for. The name on the receipt was clear and undeniable. Rick Thorne. The guide, the sole witness, the man whose story had never been questioned. That single piece of paper shifted the very foundation of the last 10 years. The receipt wasn't just paper and ink, it was a confession frozen in time. For Arthur Donovan, the grief that had been a shapeless, suffocating fog suddenly sharpened into a single, piercing point of rage. The image of Rick Thorne, the solemn survivor, the man who had told a plausible story of nature's fury, was shattered, replaced by the portrait of a calculating liar. He and Ethan sat in the heavy silence of the study, the implications of the discovery hanging in the air. This was no longer a tragic accident. It was a meticulously planned deception. The question was no longer what happened to Claire, but who had orchestrated it, and more importantly, why. They needed specialized drilling equipment in a place where nothing of value was supposed to exist. They knew they couldn't take this to the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Not yet. The original investigation had been closed with such certainty, and their evidence, a decade-old receipt and a hand-drawn map, could easily be dismissed as the desperate theory of a grieving father. They needed more. They needed an undeniable link that the authorities couldn't ignore. Their first step was to investigate the seller, Tucson Geological and Mining Supply. Arthur, using his methodical research skills honed over a lifetime in academia, and Ethan, with his practical understanding of the local business community, formed an unlikely but determined investigative team. They decided to approach the company not as accusers, but as researchers looking into historical purchases for a university project, a story just plausible enough to open a door without raising suspicion. At the supply store, they were met with initial resistance. Records from 1999 were archived, buried in a dusty back room. But their quiet persistence paid off. An older clerk, a man who had worked there for 30 years, remembered the sale. Not because of Rick Thorne, but because of the unusual nature of the order. The core drills were top of the line, industrial-grade equipment, far too expensive, and specialized for a simple desert guide or prospector. The clerk, intrigued by their academic cover story, agreed to pull the original digital invoice from the old system. And there it was, the detail that blew the conspiracy wide open. The purchase wasn't made by Rick Thorne personally. It was paid for by a wire transfer from a company they had never heard of, Oasis Holdings, LLC. The name Oasis was too much of a coincidence to ignore. It was the same word used on the fabricated map. Arthur and Ethan now had a new thread to pull, a faceless corporation. A few days of intense online research, digging through public business filings and corporate registration databases, revealed that Oasis Holdings was a shell corporation. It had no employees, no physical address beyond a P.O. box, and its sole purpose seemed to be funneling money. But after peeling back layer after layer of corporate veils, they found its parent company, TerraCore Minerals, a powerful and notoriously aggressive mining corporation with a long history of bending environmental regulations and operating in legal gray areas. The picture was becoming terrifyingly clear. This wasn't just about one man, it was about a corporate giant. With this new knowledge, Arthur returned to Claire's research, his heart pounding. He wasn't just looking for her last known movements anymore. He was looking for what she had found that made her a threat to a company like TerraCore. He spread her field journals and geological survey notes across the floor, and there, in the margins of a report from her final weeks, he found it. She had documented unusual magnetic anomalies and high concentrations of rare earth minerals, dysprosium and neodymium, in soil samples taken from an area that corresponded exactly with the fake coordinates of Whisper Oasis. She had thought she was on the verge of a historical discovery about ancient trade. In reality, she had unknowingly stumbled upon a multi-billion-dollar illegal mining operation on protected federal land. The entire conspiracy was now laid bare before them. Claire, in her pure academic pursuit, had discovered a secret that TerraCore Minerals would do anything to protect. They were illegally prospecting for immensely valuable rare earth elements, essential for modern electronics and military technology. Rick Thorne was not just a guide. He was their hired hand, their security on the ground, tasked with keeping people away. When he realized Claire had found the one thing she was never supposed to find, he had been given his orders. Whisper Oasis was the code name for their clandestine camp, and the map was a lure, designed to lead her to a secluded spot where she could be silenced without witnesses. The Haboob, the story of a tragic accident, was nothing but a carefully constructed lie to cover up a cold-blooded murder. Now, armed with a chain of evidence, the backpack, the altered map, the receipt, the link to a shell company, and Claire's own notes predicting the mineral discovery, Arthur and Ethan faced a critical decision. They had the truth, but they were two civilians going up against a powerful corporation with deep pockets and a history of making problems disappear. Taking this to local law enforcement felt like a gamble they couldn't afford to lose. The risk of the evidence being buried, of witnesses being intimidated, was too great. They needed a force multiplier, a way to bring their story into the light so powerfully that it couldn't be ignored or swept under the rug. They needed to bypass the system that had failed them once before and take their case directly to the court of public opinion. Their choice was born from a decade of institutional failure. In the quiet of Claire's study, surrounded by maps that traced a father's 10-year obsession, Arthur and Ethan came to a stark conclusion. Taking their evidence to the Pima County Sheriff's Department was a risk they couldn't take. The original investigation had been a masterclass in indifference, and TerraCore Minerals had the kind of influence that could make inconvenient evidence disappear. They needed an ally who was immune to that influence, someone whose currency was the truth itself. Their only viable path was to find an investigative journalist, someone with a national platform and a reputation for dismantling corporate corruption. It was a monumental gamble. If the story didn't land with enough force, they would be exposed and vulnerable, and the truth about Claire could be buried for good this time. They found their champion in Sarah Jenkins, a Pulitzer-nominated reporter for a major national newspaper known for her relentless pursuit of corporate malfeasance. The first meeting took place in a sterile hotel conference room, a neutral ground. Jenkins was initially skeptical, her expression guarded. She had heard countless conspiracy theories from grieving families over the years. But as Arthur laid out the evidence piece by piece, the weathered backpack, the fabricated map, the receipt for drilling equipment, and finally, Claire's own notes predicting the mineral deposits, her skepticism melted away. She saw the undeniable chain of logic. This wasn't a grieving father's fantasy. It was a meticulously documented conspiracy. The moment she held the altered map in her hands, she understood. This was the story of a lifetime, and she was going to expose every last lie. The story, titled Whisper Oasis, A Decade of Deceit in the Sonoran Desert, landed like a bombshell. It was the front-page story, a sprawling, multi-part investigation that laid out the entire conspiracy in damning detail. The public reaction was immediate and furious. The narrative of a brilliant young woman murdered for stumbling upon corporate greed resonated across the country. Phone lines at the Pima County Sheriff's Department were flooded. National news outlets descended on Tucson. The case was no longer a forgotten local tragedy. It was a national scandal. The pressure was immense, and the department, facing a crisis of public trust, had no choice but to officially reopen the investigation into the disappearance of Claire Donovan. This time, under the intense glare of a nation demanding answers. The new investigation was a world away from the cursory effort of 1999. A new team of seasoned homicide detectives was assigned, tasked with one goal: to solve the case, no matter where it led. They started with the man at the center of the original story, Rick Thorne. Under the new scrutiny, Thorne's calm demeanor began to crack. He was no longer a respected guide recounting a tragedy. He was the prime suspect in a murder investigation. Detectives also began digging into his known associates from that time, cross-referencing TerraCore's unofficial payroll records with local contractors. They were looking for a weak link, someone who might have been involved but lacked Thorne's resolve. They soon found him, a man named David Chen, a former geology student who had worked as a, quote, a site assistant for Thorne in the late 90s. David Chen had lived with the secret for 10 years, and the guilt had hollowed him out. When detectives showed up at his door in a quiet Phoenix suburb, he didn't put up a fight. The media firestorm had resurrected a ghost he thought he had buried long ago. During the second interrogation, faced with the evidence Arthur and Ethan had uncovered, he finally broke. In a flood of tears and choked words, he confessed everything. He was a young, ambitious student at the time, promised a lucrative career by TerraCore in exchange for his silence and assistance. He had been there that day. He had watched it all unfold, and the memory had haunted every single day of his life since. His confession was the key that unlocked the final, dark truths of what happened at Whisper Oasis. Chen's testimony painted a chilling, heartbreaking picture of Claire's final hours. She had followed the altered map, believing it led to a historical site. When she arrived, she found not an oasis, but a full-blown illegal mining operation. She confronted Thorne and Chen, not with anger, but with a historian's passionate disappointment. She spoke of the land's sanctity, of the Tohono O'od history they were desecrating. Thorne, on a direct call with the TerraCore executive, was authorized to offer her a substantial sum of money to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Claire refused without a moment's hesitation. Her integrity was not for sale. It was then, Chen recounted, that the executive gave the cold, simple order: make sure she never leaves that desert. The story of the haboob was concocted on the spot, a plausible fiction to hide an execution. Based on David Chen's detailed confession, a team of forensic investigators was dispatched to a remote, unmarked location a few miles from the illegal mine site. There, buried in a shallow grave beneath a cluster of ironwood trees, they found what remained of Claire Donovan. For Arthur, the news was a paradoxical agony. The 10-year-long torture of uncertainty was over, but it was replaced by the final, crushing weight of reality. He was finally able to bring his daughter home, not as the vibrant academic who walked into the desert with a heart full of passion, but as a victim of a greed she couldn't have comprehended. The discovery of her remains was the last piece of irrefutable evidence. The mystery was solved. Now the fight for justice could truly begin. The trial of Rick Thorne and the TerraCore executives became a media spectacle, a modern-day David versus Goliath story played out under the harsh lights of a federal courtroom. On one side sat a row of expensive suits, their faces impassive and calculated. On the other, a single, aging father, whose quiet dignity seemed to fill the entire room. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented the altered map, the damning receipt, and Claire's own journals. But the most powerful evidence was David Chen's testimony. His voice, cracking with a decade of guilt, painted a vivid, horrifying picture of corporate greed turning to murder. Throughout it all, Rick Thorne sat stone-faced, his eyes betraying nothing, a man who had perfected the art of the lie. But in the face of irrefutable truth, his silence was no longer plausible. It was an admission of guilt. The verdicts were delivered to a hushed courtroom. Rick Thorne was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy, receiving a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The TerraCore executive who gave the final order received the same fate. David Chen, for his cooperation, was sentenced to 15 years, a recognition of his role but also of his remorse. Several other executives were convicted on charges ranging from obstruction of justice to illegal mining, effectively dismantling the company's leadership. When the final gavel fell, Arthur Donovan did not celebrate. He simply closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. It wasn't a moment of victory, but of profound, somber finality. The war was over. The silence he had fought for 10 years had finally been filled, not with his daughter's voice, but with the sound of justice. The corporate fallout was swift and catastrophic. The Whisper Oasis scandal destroyed TerraCore Minerals, reputation beyond repair, hit with massive federal fines, shareholder lawsuits, and the permanent stain of a murder conspiracy. The company collapsed into bankruptcy within a year. Its assets were liquidated, its name becoming a cautionary tale in business schools across the country. More importantly, the case triggered a wave of legislative action. Spurred by public outrage, Congress passed the Donovan Act, a new law that dramatically increased penalties for illegal resource extraction on protected federal lands and implemented stricter oversight protocols. Claire Donovan, a historian who sought to preserve the past, had ended up protecting the future of the very landscapes she cherished, creating a legal shield forged from her own tragedy. In the quiet aftermath, Arthur Donovan found a new purpose. The civil suit against the remnants of TerraCore resulted in a substantial settlement. But for Arthur, the money was never about compensation. It was a tool. He used every dollar to establish the Donovan Foundation for History and Land Preservation. Claire's study, once a war room fueled by grief and obsession, was transformed into the Foundation's headquarters. The wall of maps remained, but now they represented not a search for a lost person, but a mission to fund the next generation of researchers. The Foundation provided grants to young, passionate academics, people just like Claire, who were dedicated to uncovering the forgotten histories of the Southwest. Arthur became the guardian of his daughter's spirit, ensuring her passion for knowledge and justice would echo for decades to come. Through the work of the Foundation, Claire's legacy was rewritten. She was no longer the tragic figure from a local ghost story, the lost historian, swallowed by the desert. She became a symbol of integrity and sacrifice. Her story was taught in ethics courses, her name invoked in debates over corporate responsibility and environmental protection. Young historians who received Donovan Foundation grants spoke of her with reverence, seeing her not as a victim, but as a martyr for the cause of truth. She had walked into the desert in search of a hidden history, and, in the most tragic way imaginable, had found it. Her death, orchestrated to conceal a secret buried in the earth, had ultimately brought that secret, and so many others, into the blinding light of day for the entire world to see. Years later, Arthur, now well into his 80s, would drive out to the edge of the Sonoran desert. The illegal mine at Whisper Oasis was gone, dismantled by federal order. The land, scarred but resilient, was slowly beginning to heal. He never visited the exact spot where Claire's remains were found. Instead, he would find a quiet overlook, a place where he could see the vast, silent expanse that had held his daughter's secret for so long. He would sit there for hours, not in mourning, but in a state of quiet communion. The ache of her absence never truly left him, but it was now intertwined with a profound sense of peace. He had found the truth, he had secured justice, and he had built a legacy that ensured Claire Donovan's voice would never again be lost to the silence. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten and that the search for truth is fundamental, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening. The story of Claire Donovan is, in the end, a story about what is buried and what endures. It began as a tale of human fragility against the immense power of nature, a simple narrative of a life lost to the elements. But the truth, when it finally surfaced, was far more complex and chilling. It was not a story of nature's indifference, but of human greed. The Sonoran Desert was never the villain. It was merely the silent, patient witness to a crime, holding a secret until the day it could no longer be contained. For Arthur Donovan, the 10-year journey through the wilderness of grief was not just a search for his daughter, but a fight against a lie that had become as vast and imposing as the desert itself. His persistence proved that no silence is permanent, and no secret is buried deep enough to escape a father's love. Claire's legacy was ultimately forged not in the academic halls she loved, but in the harsh landscape where she died. The Donovan Act stands as a permanent legal shield, protecting the very lands she sought to understand, a direct consequence of the conspiracy that took her life. Her name is now etched into federal law, a symbol of integrity against corruption. The foundation created in her honor ensures that her passion for history continues, funding a new generation of researchers who carry her torch. She is no longer remembered as a victim of the desert, but as a martyr for the truth. In a tragic, profound irony, her death accomplished what her life's work had just begun. It forced the world to pay attention to the histories and the lands that are too often overlooked and exploited. For Arthur Donovan, the final chapter of his life was not defined by loss, but by purpose. The Donovan Foundation became his sanctuary, a place where his grief was channeled into a powerful, living tribute. He found a quiet peace in nurturing the work that his daughter had started, ensuring her spirit would thrive through the discoveries of others. The community, once content with the simple story of an accident, was forced into a difficult reckoning. They learned that the most dangerous forces are not always the visible storms, but the silent, unseen currents of greed that can erode a place from within. Claire's story became a permanent part of their identity, a reminder that the truth, no matter how painful, is always worth fighting for, and that one person's integrity can indeed change the world. There is a powerful, almost elemental justice in how this story concluded. TerraCore Minerals, a corporation that sought to violently extract wealth from the earth, was ultimately destroyed by a truth the earth itself gave back. The desert they used as an alibi became the primary witness against them. The backpack, preserved by the dry air of a hidden crevice, and Claire's remains, held in a shallow grave, were the pieces of evidence that unraveled their empire of lies. It's a stark reminder that what is taken from the land is often paid back in unforeseen ways. This wasn't a supernatural event, but a convergence of chance, persistence, and the undeniable weight of a truth that simply refused to stay buried forever, as if the landscape itself had a memory. Claire Donovan's story teaches us that the search for truth has no statute of limitations. It reminds us that behind every cold case, there is a family living in the torment of the unknown, and a life whose full story deserves to be told. The decade of silence she was condemned to was not an ending, but a long, painful pause before justice found its voice. It's a testament to the idea that as long as one person refuses to forget, there is always hope. The truth may be patient, it may be hidden, but it is never truly gone. It waits for those with the courage to look for it, even when everyone else has given up. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten and that the search for truth is fundamental, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening.